Dylan packed her suitcase slowly, folding each piece of clothing with deliberate care, as though the act of order might steady the storm inside her. Los Angeles had never been kind to her. Not really, but it was familiar in the way pain can become familiar when endured long enough. Ivy's request that she leave the city echoed in her mind with unsettling persistence. Framed as concern, necessity, even kindness, yet carrying an undercurrent Dylan could not ignore. She told herself she was doing the rational thing by agreeing. That distance would bring clarity. That leaving might finally quiet the tension that had clung to her since Ivy re-entered her life. With a smile too controlled to be comforting. Still, unease followed her through every room, settling into her chest like a warning she could not translate. She tried to reassure herself that this was temporary, that compliance did not mean surrender. Ivy had offered money, more than enough to start over somewhere else, and framed it as an opportunity rather than an exile. Dylan understood the implication well enough. Leaving would erase her from the immediate picture, remove a complication, tidy up a narrative that had grown inconvenient. What unsettled her most was not the request itself but the intensity behind it. The urgency Ivy barely concealed. It felt less like concern and more like containment. Il Giardino was chosen for their final conversation because it was public. Neutral, safe, or so Dylan believed. The familiar hum of voices and clinking glasses usually soothed her, grounding her in the ordinariness of shared space. Ivy arrived composed, impeccably dressed, her smile practiced and precise. From the moment she sat down, the tension was unmistakable. Ivy spoke of logistics, of timing, of the benefits of a clean break, her tone calm but insistent. Dylan listened, nodding occasionally, her hands clenched tightly in her lap beneath the table. She tried to articulate her hesitation, to explain that leaving under these circumstances felt wrong. But Ivy's responses were swift, dismissive, carefully constructed to shut down dissent without appearing cruel. The conversation escalated quietly, words sharpened by implication rather than volume. Ivy's eyes hardened when Dylan suggested staying, even temporarily, to resolve unfinished matters. There was a flash of irritation, quickly masked but not before Dylan saw it clearly. Her heart raced and a familiar pressure began to build behind her eyes. She felt suddenly dizzy, the room tilting slightly, sounds blurring at the edges. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand honesty, but the words never came. Darkness rushed in, swift and unforgiving, and Dylan collapsed forward, the world dissolving into gasps and shouts that seemed to come from far away. At the hospital, time fractured into disjointed moments. Fluorescent lights, hurried footsteps, voices speaking in urgent tones she could not follow. Tests were ordered, scans performed, concern etched into the faces of professionals trained to hide it. The results, when they came, were grim. Dylan had suffered significant brain trauma consistent with a violent blow to the head. An injury that had gone untreated and now threatened lasting consequences. The revelation rippled outward, transforming confusion into alarm. This was no fainting spell, no stress-induced episode. This was violence. When Dylan finally regained consciousness, the effort felt monumental. Her body was weak, her head throbbing with a pain that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Will and Electra were at her bedside, their relief at seeing her eyes open quickly giving way to concern as they took in her condition. Speaking required focus she barely possessed, but determination cut through the fog. She had carried this truth long enough, and the cost of silence had nearly killed her. With painstaking effort, Dylan told them what had happened. She described the confrontation with Ivy that had preceded her injury, the demand that she leave town, the money offered as incentive. She admitted that she had refused, that she had stood her ground, unwilling to be erased. Her voice trembled as she recounted the moment Ivy's composure shattered, the sudden violence that followed, the blow she never saw coming. She was the real victim, she insisted, not a participant in some mutual misunderstanding. Ivy had struck her, and that strike had caused the injury now threatening her life. Will and Electra listened in stunned silence, the weight of Dylan's confession settling heavily between them. The idea that Ivy, so often portrayed as controlled and protective, could be capable of such brutality was difficult to reconcile. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The medical findings aligned with Dylan's account, and the fear in her eyes was not fabricated. It was the fear of someone who had been silenced and nearly destroyed for refusing to disappear. News of Dylan's condition and her revelations traveled quickly, reaching Liam with devastating clarity. He had sensed something was wrong for some time, noting Ivy's increasingly erratic behavior, her insistence on controlling narratives, her readiness to intervene whenever complications arose. The confirmation that his instincts had been correct filled him not with satisfaction but with dread. This was worse than he had imagined. The stakes were no longer emotional or reputational, they were life-threatening. Liam confronted Ivy at Spencer Publications, choosing a setting that symbolized truth and accountability rather than privacy. The tension in the room was immediate, palpable. Ivy attempted to deflect at first, her explanations polished, her demeanor defensive but restrained. She spoke of misunderstandings, of Dylan's instability, of her own efforts to manage a difficult situation responsibly. Liam refused to be placated. He pressed her relentlessly, citing Dylan's testimony, the medical evidence, the pattern of secrecy and manipulation he could no longer ignore. Cornered, Ivy's defenses began to crack. The facade she had maintained slipped, revealing desperation beneath. She confessed not in a moment of emotional collapse but with a cold acknowledgement of necessity. Yes, she admitted, she had orchestrated the cover-up. She had used money to attempt to buy Dylan's silence, to send her away quietly. When that failed, fear had driven her to violence. She claimed she had acted to protect the Forrester family from scandal, to preserve stability, to prevent a narrative she believed would destroy more than it revealed. The confession landed with crushing force. Liam was horrified not only by the act itself but by the justification Ivy offered so readily. The idea that violence could be framed as protection, that harm could be rationalized as damage control, shook him deeply. He realized then the true danger Ivy posed, not just to Dylan, but to anyone who threatened the version of reality she sought to enforce. As the consequences of Ivy's actions began to unfold, the ripple effects were profound. Trust fractured, alliances shifted, and the illusion of control Ivy had cultivated disintegrated. Dylan's struggle became a catalyst for truth, forcing long-suppressed realities into the open. Her recovery would be uncertain, her future altered irrevocably, but her voice had been reclaimed, and with it, the power to redefine the story that had nearly ended her life. In the aftermath, Liam was left to grapple with his own complicity in ignoring warning signs, in allowing charm and familiarity to obscure accountability. The recognition was painful but necessary. He understood now that silence and accommodation could be as dangerous as overt malice, that protecting reputations at the expense of truth only invited greater harm. Dylan, still fragile but resolute, became a symbol of that truth. Her willingness to speak, despite the cost, reshaped the narrative around her from liability to survivor. The city she had been asked to leave would now have to confront what it had nearly allowed to happen, and as Ivy faced the consequences of her actions, the question lingered not of whether justice would be served, but of how many lives had been quietly shaped by the belief that some truths were too inconvenient to be told. The aftermath of Ivy's confession did not bring relief. It brought a different, heavier kind of gravity. Truth, once exposed, did not settle gently into place but tore through everything that had been built on silence and convenience. At the hospital, Dylan drifted in and out of sleep, her recovery uneven and uncertain. Each moment of clarity followed by waves of exhaustion that left her disoriented and fragile. Doctors spoke carefully, explaining that the brain injury would require time, monitoring, and patience, and that no one could yet predict how complete her recovery would be. Those words echoed ominously, not only for Dylan but for everyone who loved her, because they understood now that this was not a crisis that would resolve itself quickly or quietly. Will remained at her side whenever he could, grappling with guilt that grew heavier with each passing hour. He replayed his interactions with Ivy, searching for moments where he might have noticed something off, something sharp beneath the surface. Electra, too, struggled with anger, at Ivy, at herself, at a system that had been too willing to accept a clean story rather than ask difficult questions. Watching Dylan fight to regain strength transformed their understanding of what harm really looked like. It was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was subtle, persistent, and hidden behind smiles and good intentions. As Dylan grew stronger, fragments of memory returned with unsettling clarity. She remembered the look in Ivy's eyes just before the blow, the cold certainty that had replaced persuasion when control slipped away. That memory haunted her more than the physical pain. It forced her to confront a truth she had resisted for too long. She had underestimated how far Ivy was willing to go to protect the narrative she had constructed. The realization left Dylan shaken but also strangely resolute. Surviving had given her something Ivy had tried to take: agency. Outside the hospital walls, the fallout intensified. Ivy's confession could not be contained, no matter how carefully it was managed. Whispers spread through social and professional circles, speculation feeding on the gaps between official statements. At Forrester Creations, anxiety simmered beneath the polished surface. Executives worried not only about scandal but about credibility, about how many other truths might be buried beneath the company's carefully curated image. The notion that violence had been rationalized as damage control forced uncomfortable conversations about power, loyalty, and the cost of silence. Liam found himself at the center of those conversations. His role shifting from concerned observer to reluctant catalyst. He could not shake the image of Ivy standing in his office. Her confession delivered with chilling composure. The justification she had offered, that she had acted to protect others, disturbed him deeply. It mirrored a mindset he had seen too often, where morality bent under the weight of reputation and fear. He understood now that confronting Ivy had been necessary not just for Dylan's sake, but for his own integrity. Ignoring the truth would have made him complicit. When authorities formally charged Ivy, the legal process unfolded with relentless precision. Lawyers descended, statements were drafted, and narratives were once again contested. But this time the foundation had shifted. Medical evidence supported Dylan's account, and witnesses from Il Giardino came forward, recalling the tension of that day. The way Ivy had insisted on control. Ivy's attempts to minimize her actions were no longer persuasive. The story had changed, and with it, the balance of power. In quieter moments, Dylan reflected on the irony of it all. She had been asked to leave Los Angeles to preserve peace, to disappear so others could remain comfortable. Now, her refusal to do so had forced an entire community to confront its own complacency. The city she had nearly abandoned felt different to her now, harsher perhaps, but also more honest. She began to understand that survival was not just about enduring injury, but about reclaiming the narrative that had been stolen from her. Her first public appearance after leaving the hospital was understated but significant. Supported by Will and Elektra, Dylan spoke not with anger but with clarity, describing what had happened and why she had chosen to speak despite the fear it brought. She emphasized that silence had almost cost her everything, and that protection built on lies was no protection at all. The response was immediate and polarized, support and skepticism colliding, but Dylan remained steady. She had learned, painfully, that approval was not the same as truth. Liam watched from a distance, feeling both pride and sorrow. He recognized the courage it took for Dylan to stand in that space, vulnerable yet unyielding. He also recognized the cost. Relationships would fracture, alliances would shift, and some doors would close permanently. But others, he hoped, would open, not because of sympathy, but because accountability had finally been demanded. Ivy, awaiting trial, retreated inward. Stripped of influence and certainty, she grappled with the collapse of the logic that had guided her actions. She told herself she had done what was necessary, that others would have made the same choices if pushed far enough. But the argument rang hollow now. The consequences were too real, too irreversible. In moments of solitude, doubt crept in, whispering that control had never been protection, only an illusion maintained through fear. As weeks passed, the narrative continued to evolve. Dylan's recovery progressed unevenly, marked by setbacks and small victories. Some days she felt almost like herself again. Others she struggled to remember simple things. Frustration threatening to overwhelm her resolve. Yet each challenge reinforced her determination to rebuild on her own terms. She no longer measured progress by how quickly she could return to normal, but by how honestly she could live with what had happened. The story did not end with a neat resolution. It could not. Too much had been broken, too many assumptions exposed. But something fundamental had shifted. Silence was no longer the default. Questions were being asked that had long been avoided. And though the answers were uncomfortable, they carried the promise of something better, if people were willing to listen. In the final moments of this chapter, Dylan stood alone on a quiet street in Los Angeles, the city humming around her with indifferent persistence. She felt the weight of everything she had lost, but also the strange lightness of having survived. The future remained uncertain, shaped by healing and consequences yet to unfold. Still, for the first time since Ivy had tried to erase her, Dylan felt firmly rooted in her own story. No longer a problem to be managed, but a truth that refused to disappear.